From tracking cabs to clouds, have you thought about how location data has become an integral part of our everyday lives? If you're interested in knowing the science of location better, our Introduction to Geospatial Science and Technology course is the perfect starting point for you. Designed for curious minds from all disciplines, perfect for newcomers and working professionals, this course unpacks the science and real world applications behind geospatial technology. Don't miss the chance to learn from the best in the field. Applications closing on 7 June.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. I'm Shobhankita Reddy, a research analyst with the High-Tech Geopolitics program at the Takshashila Institution, and I'm joined by Adya Madhavan. Adya is our in-house researcher on military affairs with a focus on military AI, and this episode draws from Adya's recent document on LAWS, spelled LAWS, an acronym for Lethal Autonomous Weapon Systems, which I knew nothing about until Adya started to work on this topic and talk to me about it. So I thought it might be helpful to sit down with Adya and have her explain and enlighten us about this fascinating but also controversial topic. Adya, welcome to the show.
Hi, Shobhankita. Thank you so much for that introduction.
All right. Thanks for being here. And Adya, my first query to you really is the basics. What are laws and how autonomous are they really? Have we already arrived in an era where weapons take decisions completely on their own, including the tactical, the operational, the strategic? I assume not. So, in this context of laws, what exactly are they and what really is autonomous here?
So, I think defining laws and trying to understand what exactly laws are is the hardest part. It's one of the hardest parts of the conversations. But broadly, taking from all the many definitions and understandings of what they are, in simple terms, one could say a lethal autonomous weapon system is a system that can independently find, identify, select, and attack a target with lethal force, all without needing any direct human intervention or a final sign off at the moment of attack. So these are systems that are colloquially called killer robots in public discussions, and they've been something that's featured in sci-fi for many years. And given the advancements in AI now, they've become central to conversations about military technologies. So the core issue when you're talking about lethal autonomous weapon systems is the transfer of the critical life and death decisions from a human to a machine.
Understood. And what kind of decisions are these? Are these more tactical in nature? Are they just in terms of surveillance and intelligence gathering? But is it also defensive in nature? What kind of things are today perhaps transferred away from human control towards a machine?
So I think in terms of the broader military atmosphere, many kinds of functions are transferred from human to machine. For example, China has developed an AI commander, which of course now they're saying they'll only use for wargaming, but they could theoretically use it to make tactical decisions autonomously. When we're speaking about laws, though, we're talking mostly, if not completely, about operational decisions. So, by virtue of being autonomous, a law can then choose to strike a target based on whatever the commands it's been given. And there's various fronts which you can look at autonomy from. There's the actual identification of the target, where, let's say, you identify an individual or a military base. Then there's the physical maneuvering to the target, and then there's the final striking of the target. But when we talk about laws, the most important thing that we talk about is the striking of the target. Because I think humans inherently are very uncomfortable with the idea of losing control to a machine when it comes to matters of life and death. Obviously, because of accountability, but also because there's these questions of what happens if there's an error, and these errors can obviously result in civilian casualties.
Yeah, yeah. Even in the context of the recent India Pakistan escalations, you had spoken about how loitering ammunitions that perhaps were employed could cause the same issue. So, would that also be in the category of autonomous weapon systems?
So the loitering munitions that were used between India and Pakistan are still largely older models that aren't completely autonomous. And they have already had the targets programmed into them. There's a system by which they look for radiations, they move towards radiations, and they strike. But the danger when we come to laws is if they're fully autonomous, in which they're making their own discretions, they're making their own judgments. So, in a sense, a lot of the weapons that are used today are already autonomous, which is something I think that's important to talk about. But laws are just another step forward in that kind of autonomy. So, for many years now, whether it's surface to air missiles or even something as rudimentary as landmines, there's been some degree of autonomy that's been operational for a while now. But I think what's unique with laws and sets them apart from all of these is that the operational context is much greater. For example, if you look at landmines, they're constrained in terms of both the physical space in which they operate as well as the time. A landmine is likely to go off if it is set off by someone who's right there, and the chances of its error are relatively lower because the people in its proximity are lower. Whereas with an autonomous weapon, if it's a weapon system that's flying autonomously over large territories and it has an ability to linger in the air for long periods of time, there's more scope for it to have serious errors, which I think is the biggest concern.
Yeah, yeah. You have written about how AI is, of course, a dual use technology, and this difficulty in being able to define what even laws constitutes further compounds the problem of being able to regulate or even come to a consensus about how to regulate them, right? So, in the international arena today, I think when it comes to the only agreement between US and China when it comes to AI is that the decision to use nuclear weapons should be under human control, not AI. So clearly, the bar today for regulation about any of these things is quite low. So you've also spoken about how there seems to be two broad groups of parties: those who advocate for a legally binding instrument for these autonomous weapon systems, and those who are against such a legally binding instrument, even if they support for such, some other non-binding measures. So, what do you see trends emerging when it comes to nation states and their ability or willingness, especially when they might be making strides in AI as a technology, and then they have the capability to integrate that into their military systems? Where do you see their intent and ability to collaborate or come to a consensus anywhere close to, putting together and restricting the use of some of these systems in international warfare?
So I think countries' reluctance to regulate and restrict these technologies itself comes from the fact that that means they're regulating and restricting their own capabilities. So when it comes to arms control in general, you see that countries are very reluctant to try and regulate technologies that are A, very diffused, of course, which AI is, but B, and more importantly, technologies that can provide a so-called game-changing advantage to the military. And I suspect the sense is that weapons with a higher degree of autonomy would give them a much higher access to enemy targets, which makes them less than willing to want to restrict them. And I think that's why a lot of the conversations about definitions about laws talk about weapons that are completely autonomous, where all of their functions operate without any human oversight, which A sort of talks about laws as if autonomy is some novel technology, and B, it allows anything that falls below that threshold of autonomy to not be scrutinized and be subjected to the same restriction. Like, for example, off the top of my head, Israel has used these target identification systems called Lavender and Daddy. Now, because these are merely systems and not coupled with weapon systems, they don't fall into this. But over there, also, the argument that was used to defend the use of Lavender and Daddy was to say that there was a degree of human oversight. And human oversight is used as an argument to try and shift the conversation away from weapons that are partially autonomous, because then it allows for countries to develop them. You'll also see that with a lot of countries who are against developing laws, a lot of the Central European countries, for example, they have no stake in the game. They haven't particularly been invested in developing AI technologies, and they also have no immediate active territorial conflict. Russia and China and Israel and even India to an extent have abstained from these discussions because if there are stringent legally binding restrictions put in place, it also forces them to comply. So, on one hand, of course, they want to curb anything that their enemies may do. But on the other hand, they also need to allow room for them to develop their own technologies.
Right, right. So it's almost like the arms race. It's similar. They want to advance themselves while limiting others from being able to develop or get access to the same kind of technology.
In a sense, yeah, it is a lot like from that aspect, it's a lot like an arms race, but it's much slower and it's much more diffuse because AI in itself is advancing in so many ways. And I think as applications of AI evolve, it's getting institutionalized more and more in different spheres, including the military. So laws become one very talked about aspect of AI in the military, but it's also used for other stuff, from decision support to basic things like logistics and maintenance of aircraft.
Yeah. So there are other, say, downstream effects where the employment of AI can give a nation state and its military heavy asymmetric advantage when it comes to warfare. And it might not be directly in military combat, but obviously these advancements and these capabilities add up when it comes to warfare.
Yeah. And even if it's not providing a direct military advantage in today's day and age, it helps with things like cost cutting. But of course, the argument with autonomous weapons is that, or semi-autonomous weapons rather, is that, oh, if we have autonomous drones instead of fighter aircraft, then we'll need to spend less money on paying personnel. But the flip side of that, of course, is that you'll still have to pay highly trained personnel because you need people to be able to work with these machines.
Yeah. And just taking a step further from the arms control and arms race argument, you also wrote about how arms control is usually categorized into four buckets. One might be similar to the non proliferation regime and treaty that nuclear technologies were subjected to. The other might be just agreements that are, in some sense, self nominated or binding, regulating the use of such weapons. Third is blanket bans. And fourth is arms limitation treaties. Which of these, if you were to sort of crystal gaze and predict when it comes to laws, which of them might be more applicable or less applicable? Where do you see nation states being perhaps willing to let go when it comes to regulating these technologies?
I think a non proliferation regime and a ban, first of all, are completely not possible when it comes to laws because dual use technologies are very hard to monitor and consequently, it's very hard to enforce compliance to any of these regulations. Also, because the diffusion is so widespread, it's harder to push for non proliferation because when it's a very specific niche military technology, it's easier to be like, okay, this isn't something that's that hard to control. From a humanitarian perspective, it's bad. It makes no sense. Also, when it comes to developing advanced AI capabilities, there's not a lot of public disclosure. So it's very hard to discern the intent behind a state's action when it comes to developing AI and therefore restricting law. I think the lack of a globally supported definition also only makes this problem more difficult to tackle because bans are historically just easier to succeed if they're very specific in their recommendations. But in the case of laws, since countries struggle to define them only, agreeing on exactly what a ban would entail and what specific areas would be restricted would be harder. I think then for laws, what would work by elimination is not that the to the technology itself is restricted, also, but agreements regulating the use of weapons to an extent. But not to say that laws wouldn't be used in XYZ context, but that they would be restricted in a few particular ways. In that there'd be different restrictions for different contexts, and that autonomy would become part of the conversation. So a lot of countries have been calling for quote unquote meaningful human control for laws. But right now there's very little agreement on what the phrase meaningful means as well. But I think there would definitely be some sort of regulation as the technology develops further. But a ban or revoked access to the technology or something like that wouldn't be possible.
Right. So we're a long way off from being able to meaningfully, again, to use this sort of ambiguous word, uh, to be able to meaningfully constrain the use or regulate their deployment when it comes to active warfare.
Yeah. And the other thing with active warfare is also that it's very, very hard to detect whether laws have been used, because as it is, autonomous drones, semi-autonomous drones rather, are already like being used far and wide. For example, but there's rumors of contexts where laws could have been used, but it's very hard to prove as well. For example, I think in 2020, don't quote me on this, I could be wrong, Turkey used this drone called the Cargo 2 in Libya. And later there were reports that came out saying, oh, this was the first case of a lethal autonomous weapon system being used to target people. But there's no proof. And I think that also makes it much harder for there to be any concrete restriction as of now.
Yeah. So, having established that this is a real problem with real ethical concerns, with a possibility for massive civilian casualties, away from human control, closer towards machine made decisions, obviously, we have this huge two front problem, right, in both China and Pakistan, both of whom are nuclear armed. So, what are the considerations for India in this front? What are Pakistan's and China's stance specifically when it comes to the deployment of autonomous systems? What have they agreed to? What are their stances? What are their positioning in this regard?
Okay. I'm glad you brought the conversation to that, because I think that is the meat of India's debate in laws, because China and Pakistan are so central to it. India itself, of course, maintains this official stance that a legally binding treaty is premature as of now, and it has supported non binding measures within existing UN forums. But China, on the other hand, is making significant advances in areas like AI. I told you about the AI commander. They've made major advancements in drone swarming and are considered a global leader when it comes to drones. China has maintained that restrictions on laws wouldn't be the worst things, but it's worth noting that a lot of what China says publicly can be taken with a pinch of salt, given their own internal climate. While Pakistan has called for a legally binding instrument when it comes to laws, we should also take cognizance of the fact that Pakistan and China are major, major military partners. And if there were to be another standoff with Pakistan, who buys a lot of their military hardware from China, we could be in trouble. But at the same time, India also has to consider the fact that we're putting a lot of money into developing AI domestically. And it's also in India's interest to try and shape this conversation in a way that protects India's security without restricting India's own technological advancements in the future.
Yeah, got it. Got it. So, what are our recommendations? I say our as in the Takshashila viewpoint, but really from your document and from your research, what comes out as perhaps the recommendations for India? What's the way forward? Is the only way forward that we arm ourselves with our own capabilities in both AI as well as military AI and its deployment in military systems? Is it pushing in multilateral forums for some kind of consensus in this regard? Is it all of them? What would your take on this be?
My take would be that we need to start pushing for restrictions in the international forum that are non binding as of now. Restrictions that talk about curbing laws in certain contexts without actually saying that pushing for an outright ban, but rather coming up with context specific guidelines, especially when it comes to the use of law in land, sea, and airborne engagement, since there's different challenges for mistargeting and adherence to the laws of armed conflict. For example, when it comes to sea, with submarine warfare, detecting targets is likely to have the highest rate of error. And there's also the fact that submarines are underwater for long periods of time. They loiter for extended periods. And I think in that particular context, it's in everyone's interest to say that we need to have some degree of human oversight. When it comes to land, a major consideration that needs to be taken into account is surrender, because in warfare, a lot of times there are human actions to indicate surrender. But how do you program that to an autonomous weapon? How do you recognize surrender? What does the system do when it recognizes surrender? What if it misrecognizes? So, in that context, we need to have specific guidelines. Systems with the highest endurance and range, which provides them with the ability to loiter, can pose the highest risks. So, those are the systems that should be restricted. And I think a lot of the time the conversation eliminates human oversight as allowing systems to fall under the category of laws. But I think rather we should say that any system that has autonomous capabilities should fall under the category of a lethal autonomous weapon system. But it should be mandatory for systems to have human oversight and a clear chain of accountability. For India, the biggest considerations when it comes to what these guidelines say is that any guidelines and any use of laws needs to be in accordance with our own military ethos, with our own domestic legal frameworks. And at the same time, when it comes to our domestic use of autonomous weapons, we want there to be accountability in case there's any errors. And I think that accountability is what we'd expect from our adversaries as well, what India should expect from their adversaries. And therefore, there should be recommendations on clear changes of accountabilities, the moving away from the need for a definition to start regulations. And I think as of now, there shouldn't be a legally binding regulation, because as the technology develops, then again we'll need to move forward and redefine things. But as of now, the priority should be human accountability in combat employment, while not placing any restrictions on domestic research and development or access to critical technology, because at the end of the day, everyone needs to remain technologically competitive.
Right, right. So maybe to summarize, you've spoken about how we shouldn't be waiting for a consensus on the definition to begin regulation, because that means any talk about regulation becomes dead on arrival, because obviously there is a lot of flux on what even autonomous here means, and that's a wide spectrum. So we shouldn't be holding ourselves back just in the international community to come up with a definition to begin to regulate, right? And secondly, just to underscore what you just said, states are ultimately responsible for all the actions that they undertake, that their laws, military weapon systems undertake in combat. So the accountability finally is on the nation states and the military personnel behind some of these systems. And also that you say laws should be completely excluded from the nuclear forces of any state, because we should continue to keep nuclear out of this. And definitely, India should advocate for some kind of a legally binding treaty that commits states to developing laws that are in accordance with their principles and their military ethos. Are these sort of the broad recommendations of any sort of a consensus in the international arena that we could come up with? Anything else that you would like to add?
No, I think that's it from my side. In the way I see it, what's important is that we shouldn't wait for other countries to come up with something, because it's in everyone's interest to sit on the fence. But if India were to push for a normative framework and without having to commit to anything, in the future, when that framework becomes more diffused and institutionalized, then it can be something that transforms into a legally binding instrument. And I think most importantly, autonomy needs to be taken as a continuation of older technologies, because there has been governance for older technologies. There are protocols for how missiles are used and loitering munitions are used. And I think we should continue taking that into account and remember that when we talk about laws, instead of treating them as some novel technology that's fully set apart from what already exists.
Right, right. And you've also specifically mentioned that while we advocate for some kind of measures in this regard, non-binding, binding, most likely non-binding, we must also ensure that powerful states cannot, discriminate against less powerful states when it comes to the employment of this technology. So we must ensure that whatever measures we advocate for leave little room for discriminatory use against India, because that would be against the Indian national interest.
Exactly. And I think that's reflected in India's approach to arms controls in general as well, whether it be the CTBT or the NPT or other arms controls regimes, where the emphasis on being non discriminatory is strong, because as being a middle power currently, especially for India, we're not small enough to slip away unnoticed, but we're not large enough to necessarily be able to steer the conversation in the direction we want it to head all the time. So I think we need to try as hard as we can to make sure that these things don't discriminate against us as well as other small countries, and that's why accountability is so central to the way that I think laws should be looked at.
Got it. Adya, this is very helpful. Do you have any closing thoughts to leave our to leave our listeners with? Are humanitarian groups particularly active when it comes to pushing regulation for this? Do we have perhaps on the horizon something possible, or is that a long shot away?
Humanitarian views are a part of the conversation. There's many international organizations who have been advocating against laws, calling for an outright ban. There's organizations like Stop Killer Robots and Article 370 who've written about it extensively. But I think the problem is that while there's all this focus on a ban, a lot of these organizations don't realize that this is something that's unlikely to be banned given its military utility. So perhaps if there was more discourse on how it's strategically in favor of states' interests to try and restrict these technologies, it would be more successful. Because frankly, I don't believe that when it comes to like a push or shove situation, I don't think states take humanitarian factors into consideration as much as one would expect them to.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Adya, thank you so much for this conversation and thank you for your document. I'll leave it in the show notes for our listeners to look through.
Thank you so much for having me. I hope this is of interest to people, and I hope it starts a conversation about technologies that are becoming more and more prevalent today.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.